Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, I think. It's the Basel AML Index 2024.
Oh, absolutely.
This report ranks countries based on their risk of money laundering. You know how vulnerable they are to dirty money,
Yeah.
basically. And we've got a ton of research here,
Yeah.
some anecdotes, all sorts of stuff, and we're going to see what makes a country, a haven for all this dirty money, and more importantly, why you should care.
Yeah. And you know what's really interesting is that this year's report goes beyond just the usual suspects
Right.
and sheds light on some surprising vulnerabilities, particularly related to fraud.
Yeah, I was really struck by that when I was looking through this report. It's from the
Yeah.
Basel Institute on Governance for
Hmm.
a nonprofit that really dives deep into this kind of thing. And they're saying that fraud is now a huge factor in a country's risk score.
Right.
It makes you wonder if maybe we've been focusing on the wrong things for all these years.
It definitely adds a new dimension to the conversation.
Yeah.
For a long time, money laundering was seen as primarily linked to, things like drug trafficking or organized crime.
Right.
But this report suggests that everyday fraud, the kind that you or I could even fall victim to,
Hmm.
is playing a much bigger role than we realized.
For sure. And it's not just some abstract concept either. The report highlights some really eye-opening cases.
Yeah.
Did you read about the 84-year-old man who lost his life savings to someone impersonating his granddaughter needing bail money?
Yeah, that one
Yeah.
really hit home for me. It just shows that behind all these financial crimes are real people and real consequences.
Right.
And it's not just individuals being targeted, you
Mhm.
know. The report also talks about this disturbing trend of scam centers that are often fueled by human trafficking, where victims are forced to defraud tons of people online.
It's just a reminder that this isn't just about numbers on a page, it's about real-world harm. But what really surprised me was that adding this focus on fraud actually increased the risk scores for a lot of wealthy nations.
Yeah, for sure. That was a significant finding. Countries like New Zealand, Switzerland, and Norway,
Wow.
which typically have, very strong anti-corruption measures, saw their risk scores jump considerably.
I would never have guessed that those countries would be high risk. What's the logic there?
It seems their very wealth makes them attractive targets for these fraudsters.
Oh, interesting.
They're seen as having a higher concentration of potential victims with, significant assets. Plus, there's the issue of data. Measuring fraud globally is a nightmare. There are no consistent standards,
Oh, God.
tons of underreporting. It's really hard to get a clear picture.
So even those countries with robust systems, in other areas, might have blind spots when it comes to this type of financial crime.
Absolutely.
And that makes me wonder if even the quote unquote good guys are struggling. How effective are our global efforts, really?
That's the million-dollar question. And the report delves into that by looking at the effectiveness of anti-money laundering frameworks around the world.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I know the report uses 17 indicators to assess risk.
So
It's grouped into 5 domains, but what are we actually talking about here?
it goes way beyond just laws. The quality of a country's AML framework, how transparent their financial systems are, how accountable their government is, even political and legal risks.
So it's a more holistic view than just looking at whether a country has checked off the boxes on some international checklist.
Exactly. And it starts to reveal some of the systemic weaknesses that, might not be immediately obvious.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for instance, the report highlights how even countries with strong laws on the books can really struggle if they lack things like judicial independence
Right.
or a free press. These factors play a key role in actually holding criminals accountable and preventing corruption from, running rampant.
That makes sense. If the institutions that are supposed to enforce the law are compromised, the whole system just crumbles regardless of what the rules say.
Exactly. It really underscores the importance of going beyond technical compliance and considering the bigger picture.
Okay, so while compliance is important, it's not the whole story. We need to look at the entire, the whole ecosystem to truly understand a country's vulnerability.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting because it challenges some of our assumptions about which countries are good or bad when it comes to money laundering. Take the FTTF gray list, for example.
Oh, yeah. The gray list, everyone in the space knows about that.
Oh, yeah.
But it seems like there are so many misconceptions floating around.
There definitely are.
Mhm.
People think of it as this, like a black mark or a sure sign that a country is a haven for money laundering.
Oh.
But it's really more nuanced than that.
Okay, so let's clear the air. What does the gray list actually tell us?
It means a country has been flagged by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, for having weaknesses in their systems to combat money laundering and terrorist financing.
Mm-hmm.
They're put under increased monitoring, but it doesn't automatically mean they're riddled with dirty money.
So more of a warning sign than a scarlet letter.
Yeah, I like that. And it's important to remember that landing on the gray list is rarely a surprise to these countries. The FATF has a very transparent evaluation process. They work with countries to identify areas for improvement and give them time to address the issues before publicly listing them.
So it's not a gotcha moment, but more of a collaborative process.
That's a good way to put it.
Uh,
Yeah. And while there can be negative consequences, investors might get spooked, for example,
right?
being gray listed can also be a catalyst for positive change. It can force governments to prioritize reforms that they might have been dragging their feet on.
So sometimes a bit of external pressure can be a good thing.
Absolutely. It can create this sense of urgency and political will that might not have existed before. And the FATF doesn't just name and shame.
Right.
They provide guidance and support to help countries improve their systems.
Makes sense. It's
Uh,
like, hey, we see you have some work to do, but we're here to help you get there.
Exactly. And the criteria for being listed are constantly evolving, too. The FATF recognizes that the world of finance is constantly changing, with new threats like, the rise of cryptocurrencies.
So countries can't afford to just get complacent even if they manage to get off the gray list.
Right. It's a constant process of adaptation and improvement. And this is where I think the Basel AML Index offers such valuable insights. It doesn't just look at whether a country has the right laws in place. It considers these broader factors that contribute to risk.
We've already touched on those 5 domains. The quality of a country's AML framework, levels of corruption and fraud,
Right.
financial transparency, government accountability, and political and legal risks. Let's break them down a bit further. Starting with that first domain, the AML framework. What exactly are we looking at here?
It's about more than just ticking boxes. The Basel Institute pulls data from sources like the FATF Habitual Evaluation Reports.
Uh-huh.
These reports assess how well countries are implementing international standards for combating financial crime.
So they're checking if countries have the right laws, the right institutions in place.
That's part of it, but it also goes deeper. They look at the effectiveness of those systems, how well they're actually working. Are investigations being conducted properly? Are prosecutions happening? Are they confiscating assets?
So it's not just about having rules, it's about whether those rules are actually being enforced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this domain also takes into account reports on things like drug trafficking
Oh, okay.
and human trafficking from organizations like the U.S. State Department.
Uh-huh.
These activities are often really closely linked to money laundering, so they provide valuable insight.
It's like a web, isn't it? All these different criminal activities feeding into each other,
It is.
creating a more complex picture.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have domain number 2, corruption and fraud. As we discussed earlier, this was a big change for this year's report.
That's right. The inclusion of fraud as a key indicator really shook things up. How do they even begin to measure something as widespread and often hidden as fraud?
They've tapped into the Global Organized Crime Index,
Okay.
which looks at a range of financial and cyber-dependent crimes, from tax evasion and embezzlement to
Right.
hacking and cryptocurrency scams.
So casting a wide net to capture all the various ways people are being defrauded both online and offline.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that even with these new indicators, getting a truly accurate picture of global fraud is incredibly challenging. There are inconsistencies in how data is collected and reported across different countries.
So while the report is shining a light on this issue, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting reliable data. But even with those limitations, I think it's crucial that we're acknowledging the role of fraud in fueling money laundering.
Absolutely. And that brings us to domain number 3, financial transparency and standards. This one gets to the heart of how easy it is for criminals to hide money in a particular country.
We're talking about things like tax havens, shell companies, those shadowy places where money just seems to disappear.
Exactly. The report utilizes the Financial Secrecy Index, which assesses how secretive a country's financial system is. Are there loopholes that make it easy to move money around without a trace? Are there regulations in place to prevent misuse of shell companies?
It's about making sure there's accountability built into the system. So I'm guessing a high score in this domain is not a good thing.
Not from an anti-money laundering perspective.
No.
It suggests that a country might be inadvertently creating a haven for illicit funds.
Right.
And this domain also looks at the strength of a country's financial regulations. Are banks and other institutions doing their due diligence to prevent money laundering?
So it's about making sure the gatekeepers are actually doing their jobs.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, why wouldn't a country want to have a transparent financial system? Shouldn't it be in your best interest to crack down on this stuff?
You would think so, but sometimes it's not that simple. Some countries might be reluctant to tighten regulations because they fear it will discourage investment
Oh, all
and
right,
make them
well.
less competitive in the global market.
So there's a tension there, a balancing act between wanting to attract business and making sure that business isn't facilitating criminal activity.
Exactly. And that's why this report is so valuable. It provides a framework for assessing those trade-offs and understanding the potential risks.
Okay. Let's move on to domain number 4, public transparency and accountability. This one seems a bit more abstract. How does government accountability tie into money laundering?
It's all about creating a culture of transparency. The more open a government is about its finances, about how decisions are made, the harder it is for corruption to take root. And we know that corruption is a breeding ground for money laundering.
So if the public can see where the money is going, it's harder for officials to skim off the top or engage in shady deals.
Exactly. And this domain also looks at the strength and independence of institutions.
Okay.
Is the judiciary truly independent? Are there checks and balances to prevent abuses of power?
Because if the institutions that are supposed to be fighting corruption are themselves corrupt, it creates a vicious cycle.
Precisely. And that brings us to our final domain, political and legal risks. This one's perhaps the most diverse in terms of its indicators.
I'm curious to hear more about this one. What kind of risks are we talking about?
It encompasses a range of factors, from the rule of law and judicial independence to freedom of the press and protection of civil liberties. These factors might not seem directly related to money laundering at first glance.
But they paint a picture of the overall health of a country's democratic institutions, right?
Exactly. And if those institutions are weak or compromised, it creates an environment where money laundering is more likely to flourish. If the judiciary is easily swayed by political pressure, for example, or if journalists are silenced for exposing corruption, it becomes much harder to hold criminals accountable.
So this domain is really about assessing the underlying vulnerabilities that can make a country susceptible to financial crime.
Precisely. And it highlights the fact that fighting money laundering isn't just about having strong laws and enforcement agencies. It's about creating a society where transparency, accountability, and the rule of law are deeply ingrained.
It's about creating a culture where financial crime is not only illegal, but also incredibly difficult to get away with. So we've talked about the 5 domains, the 17 indicators, the FATF gray list, all crucial pieces of the puzzle. But I'm curious to hear your take on the big picture. Are we making progress in the fight against money laundering, or are we losing ground?
That's the question everyone wants the answer to, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
We have seen some positive developments with more countries adopting international standards and implementing stricter regulations.
Sure.
But as the report highlights, compliance doesn't always equal effectiveness.
We've been talking about that, ticking the boxes isn't enough if the underlying systems are weak or if there's just a lack of political will to enforce the rules.
Exactly. And that's where I think the Basel AML Index is so valuable. It forces us to look beyond the surface and consider the more nuanced factors that contribute to a country's vulnerability.
So it's not just about celebrating the countries at the top of the list or shaming those at the bottom. It's about using this data to understand the systemic issues and finding ways to address them.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the fight against money laundering is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to challenge our assumptions.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, let's go back to something we touched on earlier, the global trend of rising compliance but declining effectiveness. What's driving that disconnect?
Well, it's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
More countries are seemingly, doing what's expected on paper, but the actual impact seems to be, going down.
It is a puzzle. I think a big part of it comes down to how we even measure success when we're talking about fighting money laundering.
Right.
How do we measure it? I imagine it's more than just counting, how many people we arrest.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not like, other areas of crime where you can just point to clear statistics.
Right.
Money laundering is often hidden. It's complex. It's transnational.
Yeah.
Even getting reliable data on the scale of the problem is a challenge.
So we're dealing with a moving target, trying to hit something we can't even fully see?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it so difficult to even know if our efforts are making a difference. The report points to a troubling trend. Actually, an increase in technical compliance with AML rules,
Okay.
but a decrease in their effectiveness.
So countries are checking the boxes, but are they missing the forest for the trees?
That's one interpretation, yeah.
Yeah.
They might have the laws, they might have the institutions, but maybe enforcement is lacking or there's a disconnect between the regulations and the reality on the ground.
It's kind of like having a state-of-the-art security system,
Right.
but forgetting to actually turn it on.
A perfect analogy. And the report highlights some specific areas where countries are falling short.
Yeah.
Things like, conducting thorough investigations, successfully prosecuting these complex money laundering cases, and actually confiscating assets.
So the money might be traceable, but actually getting it back from the bad guys is a whole other story.
Precisely. There are often loopholes in the system, jurisdictional hurdles, a lack of international cooperation. That makes asset recovery so difficult.
It sounds like we need like a more coordinated global effort, something that goes beyond just individual countries trying to tackle this problem on their own.
I completely agree. And this is where initiatives like the FATF recommendations and the Basel AML Index are so crucial. They provide this framework for cooperation, for sharing information, and for holding each other accountable.
It's about creating a network, a web of shared responsibility where everyone's working towards the same goal.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to, move beyond this simplistic view of the FATF gray list as just a list of bad countries. It's more nuanced than that. It's about identifying weaknesses, working together to address them, and ultimately making it much harder for criminals to exploit the global financial system.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, the complexities, the areas where we're still falling short. But I want to hear your perspective. Are you optimistic at all about the future of this whole fight against money laundering?
Despite all the challenges, I actually am cautiously optimistic.
Right.
I think reports like this one that shine a light on the problem and encourage, open discussion are essential. The more we understand the intricacies of money laundering, the more equipped we are to combat it.
So knowledge is power in this case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think there's this growing recognition that this isn't just a law enforcement issue, it's a societal issue. Money laundering fuels crime. It fuels corruption. It fuels instability.
Right.
It undermines our institutions, and it erodes public trust. It impacts every single one of us, even if we don't realize it.
It's like that saying, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention.
Exactly. And I think that awareness is growing. More people are asking questions, demanding accountability, and pushing for change. That's what gives me hope.
That's a great point. It's not just about governments and institutions. It's about citizens being informed, engaged, and empowered to make a difference.
Precisely. And that brings us back to you, dear listener. What stood out to you in all of this? What sparked your curiosity? What can you do to be a part of the solution?
I love that question. It's a great reminder that while this might seem like this daunting global problem, each of us has a role to play. Whether it's educating ourselves about the risks, being vigilant about our own financial security, or advocating for stronger regulations and enforcement, we can all contribute to creating a more transparent and accountable world.
Well said. And for those of you who are ready to go even deeper, I highly recommend checking out the Basel AML Index website. They have so much information, including expert editions with even more data and analysis.
Yes.
And if you work in the nonprofit sector, don't forget those editions are free.
So go forth, listeners, and keep those critical thinking caps on. The fight against money laundering is an ongoing journey, and we're all in this together. Till next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Well, it really is a tough question to answer. I think part of the problem is that we're measuring compliance instead of, actual effectiveness.
Okay, but how do we measure effectiveness? I mean, we can't just arrest our way out of this problem, can we?
Exactly. It's not as simple as just, counting arrests. Money laundering is so much more complex than that.
Right.
It's hidden. It's often transnational. It involves, incredibly sophisticated schemes.
Right.
It's incredibly difficult to even get reliable data on, the true scale of the problem, let alone how effective our efforts are.
So are we just throwing darts in the dark then? I mean, how do we know if we're making any progress at all?
It can feel that way sometimes. The report actually talks about this disconnect between rising compliance and declining effectiveness.
So countries are doing what they're supposed to on paper, but it's not actually translating into real results.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And, it comes down to a few key things. One is that enforcement might be lacking. You can have all the laws in the world, but if they're not being enforced effectively, it's not going to make a dent.
Right. It's like having that fancy security system, but leaving the door unlocked.
Exactly. And the report also highlights the challenges with things like investigations and prosecutions. Money laundering cases are notoriously complex and difficult to prosecute.
And then there's the issue of actually getting the money back.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Asset recovery is a major hurdle. There are often loopholes, jurisdictional issues, a lack of international cooperation. It's a real struggle.
So it sounds like we need a more coordinated global approach. Countries can't just be going at it alone.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why these initiatives like the FATF recommendations and the Basel AML Index are so important. They're all about encouraging cooperation, information sharing, and mutual accountability.
So creating a network, a united front, to make it harder for criminals to exploit the system.
Precisely. And that's why I think it's crucial to move away from this idea that, the FATF green list is just a list of bad countries. It's more about identifying vulnerabilities and working together to fix them.
It's about progress, not punishment.
Exactly. And I think despite all the challenge, there's reason for optimism. There's growing awareness of the issue. More people are demanding action, and more countries are realizing that they can't just turn a blind eye to this problem.
So knowledge is power and collective action is key.
Absolutely. And ultimately, the fight against money laundering is a fight for a fairer, more just, and more stable world. It's a fight worth having.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that's about all the time we have for today, but this is a topic that could fill, hours of conversation.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you for breaking it all down for us and for sharing your expertise.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, I hope you learned something new today. And more importantly, I hope this sparks some further exploration on your part. Go check out the Basel AML Index website, dig into those reports, and keep asking those tough questions.
It's a fascinating world to explore.
It is. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.